The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Medici as Lorenzo de' Medici reviewed the latest intelligence reports from his network of spies. Each parchment told the same story in different words. The masses yearned for guidance, for someone to tell them what to think, what to believe, what to fear. The irony was not lost on him that in seeking freedom from one master, they inevitably found themselves enslaved to another. This eternal dance of power and submission forms the cornerstone of human civilization. Every institution, every tradition, every social contract is built upon a fundamental understanding that the many will submit to the few, provided the illusion of choice and the promise of security are maintained. The world does not merely seek your obedience, it demands it through 1,000 subtle mechanisms, each more insidious than the last. Consider the merchant who believes himself free as he trades in the marketplace, unaware that the very coins in his purse bear the image of his sovereign, that the laws governing his transactions were written by those who profit most from his compliance. He celebrates his independence while dancing to music composed by his masters. This is the first truth that any serious student of power must understand. Freedom is largely an illusion, carefully crafted and meticulously maintained by those who understand the true nature of human weakness. The chains that bind us are not forged of iron but of habit, tradition, and the desperate human need for belonging. They are polished to a brilliant shine and presented as jewelry, as badges of honor, as the very foundations of civilized society. The citizen who pays his taxes believes he contributes to the common good, never questioning why those who write the tax laws somehow always emerge wealthier. The soldier who dies for his country believes he dies for honor, never realizing he dies to protect the wealth and power of those who will never set foot on a battlefield. These invisible shackles are more effective than any physical restraint because they convince the prisoner that he is not imprisoned at all. The slave who knows he is a slave may rebel, but the slave who believes himself free will defend his chains against any who would break them. This psychological bondage is the masterpiece of political craft, perfected over centuries of human governance and refined through countless experiments in social control. The educational system serves as perhaps the most brilliant example of this principle in action. Children are gathered at an early age and taught not to think but to recite, not to question but to accept, not to lead but to follow. They are sorted and graded, ranked and categorized, taught that their worth lies not in their individual potential but in their willingness to conform to predetermined standards. The brightest minds are channeled into institutions of higher learning where they are taught to speak in the approved languages of their disciplines, to reference the approved authorities, to ask only the approved questions. They emerge believing themselves educated when in fact they have been domesticated, trained like well-bred hunting dogs to serve their master's purposes while believing the chase is their own idea. The religious institutions play their part in this grand orchestra of control, offering comfort to the masses while ensuring their continued submission to earthly authorities. They preach of rewards in the afterlife for those who suffer silently in this one, of the virtue of poverty while their leaders live in palaces, of turning the other cheek while their enemies strike with impunity. The faithful are taught that their suffering has meaning, that their obedience is righteous, that questioning authority is tantamount to questioning the divine order itself. Meanwhile, the economic system creates its own forms of bondage, more subtle but no less effective than any feudal arrangement. The worker believes himself free because he can choose his employer, never realizing that all potential employers operate within the same system of exploitation, that his choice is between different forms of the same fundamental relationship. He trades his time, his energy, his very life force for tokens that allow him to survive another day, never accumulating enough to break free from the cycle that consumes him. The promise of upward mobility keeps him compliant, the lottery of entrepreneurial success keeps him hoping, while statistical reality ensures that the vast majority will remain exactly where the system needs them to be. The media apparatus serves as the nervous system of this vast mechanism of control, shaping perceptions and directing attention with surgical precision. The masses are fed a carefully curated diet of information, presented as objective truth but seasoned with the biases and interests of those who own the channels of communication. They debate the topics they are given to debate, fear the threats they are told to fear, celebrate the victories they are permitted to celebrate. Their outrage is channeled toward safe targets, their hope invested in powerless symbols, their energy dissipated in meaningless rituals of democratic participation. Even revolution, that supposed ultimate expression of human freedom, is often nothing more than the replacement of one set of masters with another. The passionate revolutionaries who storm the palaces of power find themselves, once victorious, adopting the very systems of control they claim to oppose. They tell themselves that their rule is different, that their cause is just, that their methods are necessary for the greater good. The faces change, the rhetoric evolves, but the fundamental relationship between ruler and ruled remains constant. This is not to say that all authority is illegitimate or that all social structures are inherently oppressive. Society requires organization, and organization requires hierarchy. The question is not whether power will exist, it will, but whether it will be wielded wisely or foolishly, openly or through deception, for the benefit of all or the enrichment of the few. The tragedy is not that humans submit to authority but that they so often submit to authority that holds them in contempt, that exploits their loyalty while giving nothing of value in return. The wise observer of human nature understands that the desire to be led is as fundamental to most people as the desire to lead is rare. The majority of humanity craves the comfort of certainty, the security of belonging, the relief from the burden of constant decision-making. They want to be told what to believe so they don't have to think, what to value so they don't have to choose, what to fear so they don't have to evaluate threats for themselves. This is neither a character flaw nor a moral failing, it is simply the natural state of most human minds, shaped by evolution to function within small tribal groups where such deference to authorities served survival purposes. The problem arises when this natural tendency is exploited by those who understand it. The modern world has grown far too complex for simple tribal authority structures, yet our psychological programming remains essentially unchanged. We are cavemen living in a digital age, our ancient instincts making us vulnerable to new forms of manipulation that our ancestors never could have imagined. The sophisticated operator in this environment understands that true power comes not from commanding obedience through force but from making others want to obey. The crude dictator rules through fear and maintains control through constant vigilance and violent suppression. His reign is precarious, his sleep troubled, his end often violent. But the master manipulator rules through love, through the willing sacrifice of his subjects, through their genuine belief that their servitude is actually freedom. His subjects fight his battles for him, police themselves according to his values, and pass his system of control on to their children as inherited wisdom. This is the genius of modern democratic systems, they provide the illusion of popular control while ensuring that real power remains concentrated in the hands of those who understand how to work the system. The citizen believes himself sovereign because he can vote, never realizing that his choices have been predetermined, that the candidates have been pre-selected, that the real decisions are made in rooms he will never enter by people whose names he will never know. His vote becomes a ritual of participation in his own subjugation, a ceremony that renews his consent to be governed by those who hold him in barely concealed contempt. The economic elite have perfected this art to an extraordinary degree. They have created a system where the accumulation of wealth automatically translates into political power, where the ability to purchase influence makes all other forms of democratic participation largely meaningless. They fund think tanks to produce the ideas that will be taught in universities, sponsor research that will reach the conclusions they need, finance campaigns that will advance their interests while maintaining the fiction that they are merely concerned citizens participating in the democratic process. The result is a form of soft totalitarianism that is far more effective than any system of overt oppression. The dissidents are not imprisoned, they are marginalized, their ideas labeled as extremist or unrealistic, their voices drowned out by well-funded opposition. The rebels are not executed, they are co-opted, offered positions within the system that give them the illusion of influence while ensuring their ultimate compliance. The revolutionaries are not destroyed, they are channeled into safe forms of expression that pose no real threat to existing power structures. This system of control extends into every aspect of human life. The foods we eat, the clothes we wear, the entertainment we consume, the relationships we form, all are shaped by forces beyond our immediate perception. All serve purposes that we rarely consider. The consumer believes himself free because he can choose between brands, never realizing that all the brands are owned by the same corporations, that his choices have been engineered through psychological research, that his very desires have been manufactured to serve commercial interests. The sophisticated individual seeking to navigate this landscape must first recognize it for what it is, not a conspiracy requiring evil intent but a natural evolution of human social organization taken to its logical extreme. The people who benefit from these systems of control are not necessarily malicious, they are simply doing what comes naturally to intelligent organisms in competitive environments. They seek advantage, they preserve their positions, they pass their privileges on to their offspring. The moral dimension of their actions is largely irrelevant to the functional reality of the system they have created. Understanding this removes the emotional charge from the analysis and allows for clear strategic thinking. The question becomes not how to rage against the machine but how to understand it well enough to either work within it effectively or to replace it with something better. Both paths require a level of sophistication that most people simply do not possess, which is why the current arrangements persist despite their obvious flaws and inequities. The individual who would break free from these chains must first acknowledge their existence. This is perhaps the most difficult step, as it requires abandoning comfortable illusions and facing uncomfortable truths. It means recognizing that much of what we consider our own thoughts and opinions have been carefully cultivated by others for their own purposes. It means understanding that our democratic institutions are largely theater, our economic freedom largely fictional, our social progress largely managed. This recognition is painful because it strips away the comforting myths that make daily life bearable for most people. The belief that we live in a just society where merit is rewarded and virtue prevails makes it possible to get up each morning and engage with a system that would otherwise seem intolerable. The belief that our votes matter, that our voices are heard, that our interests are represented allows us to feel like participants rather than victims in our own governance. But these comforting myths are also the very chains that bind us. They prevent us from seeing clearly, thinking independently, and acting effectively. They keep us invested in systems that do not serve our interests, loyal to institutions that do not deserve our loyalty, respectful of authorities who do not respect us. Breaking free requires the courage to see the world as it actually is rather than as we have been taught to see it. This process of awakening is necessarily individual and cannot be imposed from without. Each person must come to these realizations through their own experience and observation. Those who try to force this awareness on others typically succeed only in triggering defensive reactions that reinforce the very systems they seek to challenge. The psychological investment that most people have in their beliefs about freedom and justice is too great to be overcome through argument or evidence alone. The truly free individual emerges from this process of recognition not bitter or defeated but clear-eyed and strategic. They understand that the game is rigged but they choose to play it anyway, armed with knowledge that gives them significant advantages over those who still believe the official rules are the only rules. They recognize that power exists and will always exist, but they refuse to be among its unwitting victims. Part 2, The Forge of Independence. The Great Hall of the Sforza Castle echoed with the footsteps of a solitary figure as Ludovico Il Moro walked among the portraits of his ancestors. Each face stared down with the hard-earned wisdom of those who had carved their destiny from the stone of adversity, who had refused to accept the limitations that others sought to impose upon them. These men had understood a fundamental truth that the comfortable citizens of the modern world have forgotten, that true freedom is not given but taken, not inherited but forged in the fires of deliberate opposition to the forces that would keep one small and manageable. The path to genuine independence begins with a recognition that is as liberating as it is terrifying: you owe the world nothing. The obligations that bind most people to lives of quiet desperation are largely self-imposed, based on assumptions that crumble under serious examination. The expectation that you will follow a prescribed path through life, education, career, marriage, retirement, death is nothing more than a social convenience that serves the interests of those who profit from predictable human behavior. Breaking free from these expectations is not rebellion, it is simply the reclaiming of your fundamental right to determine your own existence. Most people live their lives in a state of constant apology for their ambitions, their desires, their very existence. They seek permission where none is required, approval where none should be necessary, validation from authorities who have no legitimate claim to judge them. This servile mentality is carefully cultivated from childhood through institutions that reward compliance and punish independent thinking. The school system teaches children to raise their hands before speaking, to wait for permission to use the bathroom, to accept that their worth is determined by the grades assigned by others. These lessons in submission are reinforced throughout adult life by employers, governments, and social institutions that demand deference to their arbitrary authority. The individual who would break these chains must first reject the fundamental premise underlying them, that other people have the right to control your life simply because they claim to know what is best for you. This rejection must be total and uncompromising because any acceptance of illegitimate authority in one area inevitably spreads to others. The person who accepts that the government has the right to tell them what they can put in their own body will find it difficult to resist when that same government wants to tell them what they can think or say or believe. This does not mean that all authority is illegitimate or that all social cooperation is slavery. There are times when submitting to authority serves your own interests, when cooperation advances your goals, when compromise achieves your objectives. The key distinction is between chosen submission and imposed submission, between strategic cooperation and mindless compliance. The free individual retains the right to withdraw consent, to renegotiate terms, to walk away when the relationship no longer serves their interests. Building true independence requires the development of capabilities that make such choices meaningful. Financial independence is perhaps the most fundamental, as it provides the material basis for all other forms of freedom. The person who depends entirely on others for their survival has limited options when those others make demands on their conscience or their time. This is why the sophisticated systems of control work so hard to keep people financially dependent, through debt, through just-in-time employment, through the destruction of traditional forms of wealth accumulation that once provided families with genuine security across generations. The path to financial independence in the modern world requires understanding money not as governments and banks teach it but as it actually functions. Money is not a store of value but a system of control, not a neutral medium of exchange but a tool for transferring wealth from those who work to those who manipulate the monetary system. The individual who accepts the official explanations of how money works will find themselves perpetually impoverished regardless of how hard they work or how much they earn. True wealth comes from understanding and exploiting the gaps between official reality and actual reality. While the masses are taught to save money in banks that pay interest rates below inflation, the sophisticated operator invests in assets that benefit from monetary expansion. While the workers are taught to pay their taxes honestly and completely, the wealthy structure their affairs to minimize their obligations to systems that do not serve their interests. While the citizens are taught to respect property rights, the elites use legal mechanisms to appropriate private property for public purposes that somehow always benefit private interests. This is not about breaking laws but about understanding that the law itself is often a mechanism of exploitation disguised as justice. The tax code, for instance, is written in such a way that those with sufficient resources to hire competent advisors can legally minimize their obligations while those without such resources pay disproportionate amounts. The regulatory system is structured to protect established businesses from competition while appearing to protect consumers from exploitation. The financial system is designed to transfer wealth from savers to borrowers, from productive enterprises to speculative activities, from the general population to a small class of financial intermediaries. The individual seeking genuine independence must educate themselves in these realities not because they are pleasant but because they are true. Knowledge of how systems actually work, as opposed to how they are supposed to work, provides enormous advantages to those willing to act on that knowledge. This education cannot be obtained through conventional channels because those channels are controlled by the very interests that benefit from public ignorance about these matters. Personal independence also requires the development of practical skills that reduce dependence on complex supply chains and institutional services. The person who cannot grow food, repair equipment, maintain their shelter, or provide for their basic needs without institutional support is not truly free regardless of their financial resources. Modern civilization has created unprecedented levels of specialization that make individuals extremely vulnerable to disruptions in the systems that support them. Learning practical skills serves multiple purposes beyond mere preparedness for potential disruptions. The process of developing competence in physical tasks provides psychological benefits that are difficult to obtain through purely intellectual or financial pursuits. There is a deep satisfaction that comes from creating something with your own hands, from solving practical problems through direct action, from knowing that you can survive and thrive regardless of what institutions might do or fail to do. These skills also provide independence from service providers who often charge premium prices for basic tasks that can be learned and performed by anyone with sufficient motivation. The person who can repair their own vehicle, maintain their own property, prepare their own food, and provide for their own security is immune to a wide range of economic pressures that keep others dependent on systems they cannot control. Physical fitness represents another crucial component of genuine independence. The weak and unhealthy individual is necessarily dependent on others for protection and care, making them vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation. The strong and healthy individual has options that are simply not available to those who have neglected their physical development. This goes beyond mere health considerations to encompass the psychological effects of physical competence and the social advantages that come from projecting strength and vitality. The cultivation of physical capability also serves as training for the mental disciplines required for independence. The process of building strength requires persistence, planning, and the willingness to endure discomfort in service of long-term goals. These same qualities are essential for achieving independence in other areas of life. The person who lacks the discipline to maintain their body is unlikely to have the discipline required for financial independence or intellectual development. Mental independence is perhaps the most challenging form of freedom to achieve because it requires not only learning new information but unlearning deeply ingrained assumptions and beliefs. Most people's worldview is constructed from a combination of childhood indoctrination, peer pressure, and institutional propaganda. Breaking free from these influences requires constant vigilance and the willingness to question even the most fundamental assumptions about reality. This process begins with the recognition that most of what passes for news, education, and expert opinion is actually sophisticated manipulation designed to serve specific interests. The media organizations that claim to provide objective information are owned by corporations that have agendas beyond mere truth-telling. The educational institutions that claim to develop critical thinking actually train students to accept certain premises without question. The experts who claim to provide disinterested analysis are often paid by organizations that benefit from specific policy outcomes. Developing intellectual independence requires building information gathering and analysis capabilities that operate outside these compromised channels. This means learning to identify primary sources, understanding statistical manipulation, recognizing logical fallacies, and developing the ability to trace financial incentives that might bias supposedly objective information. It also means cultivating relationships with individuals who share the commitment to truth over comfort and who can provide alternative perspectives on important issues. The intellectually independent individual learns to think in systems rather than isolated events, to recognize patterns across different domains, to understand how apparently unrelated phenomena might be connected through underlying structures and incentives. This type of thinking is actively discouraged in most educational and professional settings because it leads to uncomfortable questions about the legitimacy and sustainability of existing arrangements. Perhaps most importantly, intellectual independence requires the courage to hold unpopular opinions and to act on conclusions that others might find threatening or disturbing. The person who understands that the conventional wisdom is often wrong but lacks the courage to act on that understanding gains no practical benefit from their superior knowledge. True independence requires not only seeing clearly but acting decisively based on that vision. Social independence represents another crucial dimension of genuine freedom. Most people are so deeply embedded in social networks that depend on their compliance with group expectations that they cannot afford the social costs of genuine independence. Their friendships, family relationships, professional associations, and community connections are all contingent on their continued adherence to acceptable opinions and behaviors. Breaking free from these social constraints requires the willingness to lose relationships that are based on false premises. This is painful because humans are social creatures who depend on connection and belonging for psychological well-being. However, relationships that require you to betray your own understanding and principles are ultimately destructive to your development as an individual. The independent individual learns to form connections based on mutual respect for autonomy rather than shared compliance with external authorities. These relationships are necessarily fewer but far more meaningful than the superficial connections that characterize most social networks. Quality replaces quantity as the standard for social connection. Building social independence also requires developing the skills necessary for leadership rather than followership. This does not mean seeking formal positions of authority but rather developing the capacity to influence outcomes through personal example and competent action. The person who consistently demonstrates good judgment and effective action naturally attracts others who share similar values and objectives. Leadership skills are particularly important because they provide alternatives to submission when dealing with institutional authority. The person who can organize others, communicate effectively, and coordinate group action has options that are not available to isolated individuals. Even small groups of competent and committed individuals can often achieve results that seem impossible to those who think only in terms of individual action or mass movements. The development of genuine independence is necessarily a gradual process that unfolds over years or even decades. It cannot be achieved through sudden dramatic gestures or by simply declaring oneself free from all constraints. Each step toward independence must be built on a foundation of real capability and genuine understanding, or it will collapse under pressure. This gradual approach also allows for the testing and refinement of methods and strategies. The path to independence is not the same for everyone, as individual circumstances, resources, and objectives vary widely. What works for one person might be disastrous for another. The wise individual experiments carefully and learns from both successes and failures rather than following rigid formulas or ideological prescriptions. The process of building independence also serves as a filter that separates those who are serious about freedom from those who merely enjoy complaining about its absence. The genuine pursuit of independence requires sacrifices that most people are unwilling to make. It demands the acceptance of responsibility that most people prefer to avoid. It requires the development of capabilities that most people find too difficult or time-consuming to acquire. This filtering effect is actually beneficial because it ensures that those who achieve genuine independence are surrounded by others who share their commitment to freedom and personal responsibility. The community of truly independent individuals, while small, represents a concentration of capability and understanding that can accomplish remarkable things when properly organized and directed. The rewards of genuine independence extend far beyond mere freedom from external control. The process of developing independence creates a sense of competence and self-respect that cannot be obtained through any other means. The knowledge that you can take care of yourself and those you care about regardless of external circumstances provides a form of security that no institution can provide and no government can guarantee. Independence also creates opportunities for achievement that are simply not available to those who remain dependent on institutions and authorities for their basic needs and security. The free individual can pursue objectives that serve their own values rather than the values imposed by others. They can take risks that dependent individuals cannot afford, explore possibilities that conformists would never consider, and achieve results that seem impossible to those who think only within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Perhaps most importantly, genuine independence creates the possibility for authentic relationships and meaningful contributions to the world. The person who has freed themselves from the need for approval and validation can form connections based on genuine affinity and mutual respect rather than social convenience or professional necessity. They can contribute to causes they actually believe in rather than causes that are expected or socially acceptable. This authenticity becomes a powerful force for positive change because it demonstrates to others that alternatives to conventional life paths are not only possible but potentially more rewarding than the prescribed routes to success and happiness. The example of a genuinely independent individual often inspires others to question their own assumptions and to consider possibilities they had never seriously contemplated. Part 3: The Mastery of Strategic Ruthlessness in the Private Chambers of the Vatican. Pope Alexander VI studied a detailed map of the Italian peninsula while his son Cesare Borgia outlined their latest political stratagem. The conversation that transpired between them would have scandalized the faithful, had they been permitted to hear it, for it concerned itself not with moral principles or divine guidance but with the cold calculus of power and the strategic application of force. Yet this scene, repeated countless times throughout history in the courts and council chambers of those who shape the world, reveals a truth that the comfortable classes prefer to ignore, that effective action in a competitive world requires a form of ruthlessness that transcends conventional morality. The mastery of strategic ruthlessness begins with the recognition that the world is not organized according to the principles taught in churches and schools. While the masses are instructed in the virtues of fairness, honesty, and compassion, those who actually wield power operate according to entirely different rules. They understand that survival and success in a competitive environment require the willingness to do what is necessary rather than what is comfortable, what is effective rather than what is approved, what achieves results rather than what maintains the illusion of moral purity. This does not mean that the successful individual is necessarily evil or that achievement requires the abandonment of all ethical considerations. Rather, it means that effectiveness requires a sophisticated understanding of when conventional moral principles serve your interests and when they do not. The person who rigidly adheres to moral rules that their competitors ignore will find themselves at a systematic disadvantage that eventually becomes insurmountable. The concept of strategic ruthlessness must be carefully distinguished from mere cruelty or vindictiveness. The cruel person inflicts suffering for its own sake, driven by psychological defects or emotional immaturity. The vindictive person seeks revenge against those who have wronged them, prioritizing emotional satisfaction over practical results. Neither of these approaches serves the interests of the individual seeking genuine power and influence. Strategic ruthlessness, by contrast, is characterized by emotional detachment and practical focus. The strategically ruthless individual evaluates situations based on their potential to advance or hinder long-term objectives. They make decisions based on likely outcomes rather than personal feelings. They apply pressure precisely where it will be most effective and withdraw it when it no longer serves their purposes. They treat people according to their utility rather than their social status or their claims to deserve better treatment. This approach requires the development of several key capabilities that are rarely taught in conventional educational settings. The first is the ability to accurately assess other people's motivations, capabilities, and limitations. Most people project their own psychology onto others, assuming that everyone shares their values, fears, and decision-making processes. This assumption leads to systematic misunderstandings that can be exploited by those who see more clearly. Understanding human nature as it actually is rather than as it ought to be provides enormous advantages in any competitive situation. The person who recognizes that most people are primarily motivated by fear, greed, pride, and the desire for social acceptance can predict and influence their behavior with remarkable precision. The person who understands that most people avoid responsibility, prefer simple explanations to complex ones, and choose immediate gratification over long-term benefits can structure situations to channel their behavior in desired directions. This psychological insight must be combined with the ability to control and direct one's own emotional responses. The person who allows anger, fear, pride, or other emotions to drive their decision-making will make predictable mistakes that more disciplined competitors can exploit. Emotional discipline is not about suppressing feelings but about ensuring that feelings do not interfere with clear thinking and effective action. The development of emotional control requires regular practice in situations where the stakes are high enough to matter but not so high that failure would be catastrophic. This might involve negotiating significant business deals, managing difficult personal relationships, or competing in demanding athletic or intellectual contests. The goal is to develop the ability to remain calm and focused under pressure while maintaining the capacity for strategic thinking and tactical flexibility. Strategic ruthlessness also requires the willingness to make hard choices that others would avoid. This includes the termination of relationships that no longer serve your interests, the abandonment of projects that are not producing desired results, and the application of pressure to those who obstruct your legitimate objectives. Most people avoid such choices because they are emotionally difficult and because they conflict with social expectations about how decent people should behave. However, the avoidance of hard choices typically leads to worse outcomes for everyone involved. The business leader who avoids firing incompetent employees ultimately hurts the competent employees who must compensate for their colleagues' failures. The individual who maintains toxic relationships out of misplaced loyalty ultimately enables destructive behavior that harms everyone in their social circle. The leader who avoids confronting problems because confrontation is uncomfortable ultimately allows small problems to grow into large ones that cause greater suffering to more people. The strategically ruthless individual makes these hard choices quickly and cleanly, minimizing suffering while maximizing effectiveness. They understand that temporary pain often prevents greater pain later, that short-term conflict often leads to long-term peace, that apparent cruelty can be the kindest option when the alternatives are carefully considered. This principle extends to the management of information and the strategic use of truth and deception. While conventional morality teaches that honesty is always the best policy, strategic effectiveness requires a more nuanced understanding of when truth serves your interests and when it does not. The person who tells the truth to everyone about everything will find themselves at a systematic disadvantage when dealing with those who are more selective about their disclosures. Strategic information management is not about pathological lying but about understanding that different people need different information to make decisions that serve your mutual interests. The successful leader provides subordinates with the information they need to perform their roles effectively while withholding information that would distract them from their responsibilities or compromise their ability to function effectively. This selective disclosure of information must be combined with the ability to gather intelligence about competitors and potential threats. The individual who operates without good information about the intentions and capabilities of others is essentially fighting blind. They cannot anticipate threats, identify opportunities, or make informed decisions about strategic relationships. Building effective intelligence capabilities requires the development of networks of relationships with people who have access to relevant information and the incentive to share it. This is not about creating a network of spies but about cultivating mutually beneficial relationships with individuals who naturally come into contact with useful information in the course of their normal activities. The strategic management of relationships is perhaps the most complex aspect of effective ruthlessness. Most people approach relationships either sentimentally or transactionally. The sentimental approach treats all relationships as equally valuable regardless of their practical utility. The transactional approach treats relationships as purely commercial exchanges with no emotional or psychological dimensions. Strategic relationship management combines elements of both approaches while avoiding the weaknesses of either. The strategically ruthless individual values relationships based on their contribution to long-term objectives while recognizing that sustainable relationships must provide mutual benefits. They invest time and energy in relationships that have the potential to produce significant returns while avoiding relationships that drain resources without providing compensating benefits. This does not mean treating people as mere instruments to be used and discarded. Rather, it means understanding that your time and energy are limited resources that must be allocated strategically to achieve your most important objectives. The person who tries to maintain deep relationships with everyone ends up having superficial relationships with everyone. The person who focuses their relationship building efforts on the people who matter most to their long-term success can develop truly valuable connections that serve mutual interests over extended periods. Strategic ruthlessness also requires the ability to identify and exploit the weaknesses of competitors and opponents. Every individual and organization has vulnerabilities that can be identified through careful observation and analysis. These might include psychological blind spots, resource constraints, internal conflicts, or strategic dependencies that can be disrupted. The identification of weaknesses is only the first step in this process. The more important capability is the strategic application of pressure that exploits these weaknesses in ways that serve your objectives. This might involve competitive actions that force opponents to defend vulnerable positions, alliance building that isolates opponents from their sources of support, or information campaigns that highlight opponent weaknesses to relevant audiences. The application of strategic pressure must be carefully calibrated to achieve desired results without creating unnecessary enemies or provoking responses that could be more damaging than the original problem. The goal is not to destroy opponents but to neutralize their ability to interfere with your objectives. In many cases, this can be achieved through demonstrating superior capability rather than through direct confrontation. The timing of strategic actions is crucial to their effectiveness. Pressure applied too early may allow opponents time to adapt and respond. Pressure applied too late may come after opponents have already achieved objectives that make your response irrelevant. The sophisticated operator develops the ability to recognize optimal timing and to act decisively when circumstances are most favorable. This temporal dimension of strategy requires the ability to think in multiple time horizons simultaneously. Immediate tactical considerations must be balanced against medium-term strategic objectives and long-term vision. Actions that serve short-term interests may undermine long-term goals, while actions that serve long-term interests may require short-term sacrifices that are difficult to justify to others. The mastery of strategic ruthlessness also involves understanding when to apply maximum pressure and when to show restraint. The crude operator applies constant pressure indiscriminately, creating unnecessary resistance and exhausting their own resources. The sophisticated operator varies their approach based on the specific requirements of each situation, sometimes applying overwhelming force and sometimes exercising careful restraint. This variability serves multiple strategic purposes. It makes the operator unpredictable to competitors, making it difficult for them to develop effective countermeasures. It conserves resources for situations where maximum impact is possible. It creates opportunities for alliance building with those who might otherwise be neutral or hostile. The strategic use of rewards is as important as the strategic application of pressure. Most people are more motivated by the prospect of gaining something valuable than by the threat of losing something they already have. The skilled operator understands how to structure incentives that channel other people's behavior in desired directions while making them feel that they are acting according to their own interests. This approach is more sustainable than pure coercion because it creates willing cooperation rather than grudging compliance. People who feel that they benefit from their relationship with you are more likely to provide reliable support over extended periods. They are also more likely to take initiative in ways that serve mutual interests rather than simply following orders. The creation of effective incentive structures requires deep understanding of what different people value and how those values can be served through cooperation with your objectives. This might involve providing opportunities for advancement, recognition, financial gain, or simply the satisfaction of being associated with successful enterprises. Strategic ruthlessness must be combined with the ability to maintain a positive public image and to operate within the bounds of social acceptability. The operator who is perceived as completely amoral will find it difficult to attract allies and may provoke coordinated opposition from those who feel threatened by their methods. This requires the development of sophisticated communication skills that allow you to frame your actions in terms that others can accept and support. The same strategic objectives can be presented as aggressive expansion or as defensive necessity, as personal ambition or as service to a higher cause, as ruthless competition or as the natural operation of market forces. The ability to control narratives and shape perceptions is a crucial component of strategic success. Most people base their judgments on limited information filtered through their existing beliefs and biases. The skilled operator understands how to provide information and interpretations that lead others to conclusions that serve the operator's interests while allowing them to feel that they have reached those conclusions independently. This narrative control must be authentic enough to withstand scrutiny from sophisticated observers while being simple enough to be understood and accepted by the broader public. It requires the ability to identify the key elements of any situation that will determine public perception and to ensure that those elements are presented in the most favorable possible light. The ultimate expression of strategic ruthlessness is the ability to achieve objectives through the voluntary cooperation of others who believe that they are serving their own interests. This requires understanding human psychology well enough to structure situations where what people want to do coincides with what you need them to do. This level of strategic sophistication represents the highest form of power because it is largely invisible to those who are influenced by it. Unlike coercion, which creates resentment and resistance, and unlike manipulation, which can be detected and countered, this approach creates genuine alignment between your objectives and other people's interests. The development of these capabilities requires years of study, practice, and refinement. It cannot be learned through reading alone but must be developed through direct experience in competitive environments where the stakes are real and the feedback is immediate. The individual who seeks to master strategic ruthlessness must be willing to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from both successes and failures. The rewards of this mastery extend far beyond mere personal success. The strategically ruthless individual becomes capable of achieving objectives that benefit large numbers of people, of creating organizations that survive and thrive over extended periods, of leaving lasting legacies that continue to influence the world long after they are gone. Perhaps most importantly, the mastery of strategic ruthlessness creates the possibility of genuine choice about how to use power once it is obtained. The person who achieves power through luck or inheritance often lacks the skills necessary to use it effectively. The person who achieves power through the mastery of strategic principles retains the ability to direct that power toward objectives of their own choosing. This freedom to choose how to use power represents the ultimate liberation from the forces that seek to control and direct human behavior according to their own agenda. The strategically ruthless individual becomes capable of shaping the world rather than merely reacting to it, of creating the future rather than simply adapting to whatever future others create. The world will always seek your obedience because obedience is useful to those who hold power. But obedience is a choice, not a requirement. The individual who develops the capabilities described in this treatise gains the power to choose when to cooperate and when to resist, when to follow and when to lead, when to accept the world as it is and when to work to transform it according to their own vision. The chains that bind humanity are real, but they are not unbreakable. The forces that seek to control individual destiny are powerful, but they are not invincible. The systems that channel human energy toward the objectives of others are sophisticated, but they are not perfect. The mastery of strategic ruthlessness provides the tools necessary to break free from these constraints and to forge a destiny worthy of human potential. This is not a path for everyone, as it requires capabilities that few possess and sacrifices that few are willing to make. But, for those who have the courage to pursue genuine freedom and the intelligence to master the necessary skills, it represents the only reliable path to authentic power and lasting achievement. The choice, as always, remains yours to make. In the end, we are all alone with our choices. The question is not whether others will approve of what we do, but whether we will be able to live with ourselves having done it. The strategically ruthless understand that the greatest victory is not the defeat of external enemies but the conquest of internal limitations that prevent us from becoming what we are capable of becoming.